Hello, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for What is Inner Work for Social Change, a fireside chat with two brilliant individuals, Peggy Dulany and Bob Boisture. This discussion is the first event of our four-part virtual learning series, launching the Inner Work for Social Change project in partnership with the Fetzer Institute. Our session today is also part of Synergos Digital, a suite of virtual programming on topics that are critical to the world, especially in 2020 and beyond. All our offerings support Synergos' mission to build a world that is just, equitable, and regenerative. We are grateful for your presence today and encourage you to share your thoughts and questions in the Zoom chat. Feel free to type hello and where you're tuning in from via the chat. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing my dear colleague and our host for today's discussion, Catherine Ewell, the manager on the advisory team at Synergos and the lead on the Inner Work for Social Change project. Catherine, welcome.
Thanks so much, Marina, and hello everyone. Welcome to the launch of our Inner Work for Social Change project, an exciting milestone which we are thrilled to share with all of you. My name is Catherine. I'm a manager on the Synergos advisory team. We offer strategic counsel and research to foundations, philanthropists, and companies. I will be your host for today and will be guiding us through our discussion. To kick us off, I wanted to first run through our agenda for today. We'll start off with a brief introduction to the Inner Work for Social Change project, followed by the majority of our time will be spent engaging in a fireside chat with our featured guests, Peggy Dulany, founder and chair of Synergos, and Bob Boisture, the president and CEO of the Fetzer Institute. We'll open up for Q&A from participants, so feel free to start dropping those questions into the chat, and then we'll wrap up with some next steps. With that, I think we can go ahead and get started. So today we are gathered for a fireside chat between the leaders of the organizations at the helm of Inner Work, the Fetzer Institute and Synergos. The Fetzer Institute is a national organization that helps to build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. And Synergos is a global organization helping solve complex issues around the world by advancing bridging leadership, which builds trust and collective action. The Inner Work for Social Change project was initiated in 2018 by our two organizations, with the objective to dissect the role of personal transformation in achieving social impact. At the core of the project are 6 in-depth case studies about partnerships that address urgent and persistent social problems, including child malnutrition in India, infant and maternal mortality in Namibia and the Philippines, dysfunctional schools in South Africa and Brazil, and a fragmented agroeconomy in Ethiopia. These case studies reveal the connection between inner work and outer action, between individual and collective purpose, and how one enriches the other. Together, the case studies reveal the relationship between inner work, bridging leadership, and collaboration, all crucial ingredients for social change. Accompanying these case studies is a series of 4 virtual learning sessions, the first of which is today, a visual storytelling platform, a concept paper that proposes a universal definition of inner work, a cross-case analysis, a research piece that makes the case for why inner work is so critical. All of these resources will be publicly available following each session, and each session will build on the prior discussion. Towards the end of today's session, I'll share additional information around how to stay engaged and join our future discussions. And we really hope that you're able to join us on this learning journey together. Now with that, allow me to introduce my dear colleague, Swati Chaudhary, who is going to guide us through the fireside chat with our esteemed guests. Swati is a managing director at Synergos and the leader of our advisory unit. Over to you, Swati.
Thank you, Catherine. Friends and colleagues, it is my privilege to be in the wonderful company of Peggy, Bob, and yourselves. Thank you again for joining us. If you haven't already, do introduce yourselves on Zoom, say hello, tell us where you're zooming in from. This is a conversation amongst all of us. If you like something that is said, use the Zoom reactions function to do a thumbs up, clap, or simply use the chat function to emote verbally. If you have a question, put it in the chat function. I will be looking out for your questions. And if we cannot get to all of them in the live session, we will find a way to address them. So please send them over. And now allow me to introduce our esteemed guests. Folks, Peggy Dulany, in addition to being a wilderness inner work guide, is the founder and chair of Synergos. Synergos operates with a vision for a world that is just, equitable, peaceful, and regenerative. And Bob Boisture is the president and CEO of the Fetzer Institute, an organization with the mission to help build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. Both Peggy and Bob have been decorated, influential, and inspiring forces in the social change space. I know their work has deeply influenced me personally, and I suspect many of you as well. They also might be two of the OGs in the inner work for social change topic, and certainly at the helm of this conversation. Peggy and Bob, it is my pleasure to welcome you both.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you, Swati. And thank you, Marina. It's great to be here with you all.
Wonderful to have you both. So Peggy and Bob, you are both renowned leaders in the social impact sector, and you both embody inner work for social change personally and professionally. You know, when we spoke the other day, Bob, you said something that I absolutely loved, that we cannot go into social change and fix other people. The heart we bring is the most important. And Peggy, you've infused a very similar ethos at Synergos. And now enter the year 2020, and we are confronted with this immense and urgent need for social change. So expounding at the nexus of this, a simple question for both of you. What is the connection between inner work and social change? And Peggy, how about we start with you, and Bob, will come to you after.
So I was just thinking about this since our conversation the other day, and I'm simultaneously reading two books. One is Brene Brown's Dare to Lead, and the other is Isabel Wilkerson's Cast. And if you look at what Brene says about the importance of vulnerability, in essence, authenticity, as well as the courage to share that with others on the one hand, that's the inner work piece. And then you look at Isabel Wilkerson's brilliant assessment of the US, but other countries as well, but primarily the US, as a caste system, not a racial system. And the big distinction in that, other than the fact that there's no such thing as race, because we're all human beings, is that the caste system is built in structurally. And it's going to take more than a political shift to overcome that. It's going to take a huge amount of each of us examining ourselves and who we are and what our obstacles to creating a humane and harmonious society are, so that we can actually both eliminate the caste system, which is at the root of a lot of the social and economic problems that we face, but also eliminate the prisons that a lot of us live in with the obstacles and the impediments that keep us from being our full selves, that allow us to be vulnerable and ultimately to serve with love.
And I want to come back to the serve with love. Hold that thought, Peggy. And Bob, how about you? What for you is the connection between inner work and social change?
Well, the first thing I'll say is good morning to everyone who's joined this call. Deep gratitude, and it's just exciting and inspiring to me that we have with us this morning people from all over the world who something in your heart tugged you into this conversation, because you also share the instinct that there's a deep connection between the way we are in our innermost selves and the way we are in the world. And I think the importance of that connection is greater than ever. As I wake up every morning in this world that for all of us around the world has just turned upside down over the last 8 months with the pandemic. And then each of us wakes up wherever we are with our own more local challenges. Here in the US, our world has turned upside down yet again in the last 3 months with the racial reckoning that we are now facing. And Peggy, I agree, maybe a more powerful way to think about it is the caste reckoning. And we are dealing with both of those challenges in the context of a social system, political system that has been becoming increasingly dysfunctional for years. And this pandemic and racial reckoning are like, I think, a stress test for a heart patient. They're revealing all of the pre-existing pathologies that are making it so hard. And I think for me, and I can just speak, I'm just going to try to speak from my own lived experience throughout this whole conversation. I wake up every morning with two big challenges. One is relates to how I hold myself, and the other relates to how I hold others. Confess to being a driven person, somebody who lives, my default would be to live in my head and to think I'm smart enough to fix problems and fix people, but also gripped by all the dark forces pulling us toward fear and separation and anger and despair. First thing I've got to do is try to get my own heart in the right place to do what I have to do that day. And for me, inner work has always been absolutely crucial. We'll talk about it in greater depth as we go through this conversation. But my lived experience is that when I go deep inside, I encounter something larger than myself. And it's an ineffable experience that we all put different words and concepts around. All I can say is that that something more has been there for me throughout my life. And I think the truest thing I can say about it is that I feel held in love and feel that the biggest thing I can do that day to bring myself into deep alignment with the heart of reality is to love. And so inner work is crucial for me to get to that place. But then I think it's also crucial as we engage in a world where more and more, I think the fundamental presenting challenge is that we have gotten so good, our cultures have gotten so good at dividing us and encouraging us to dehumanize and more demonize the other, whichever divide we're looking over. And how do we, as people who aspire to be bridgers, to use Synergos' language, get to a place where we can engage folks across divides with love and humility and respect, the essential virtues without which I don't think we'll ever make progress. So, inner work is crucial there as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would love to come back to the connection between inner work and purpose and bridging. But first, love. Peggy and Bob, love is at the center of so much of what you do and how you communicate on this call, as well as just having experienced it firsthand. Peggy, for me, Synergos is the first workplace where love was introduced in my professional vocabulary. And your philosophy of serving with love has been influential for so many of us. And Bob, partnering with Fetzer is where I saw this concept so deeply embedded in the mission of a partner, of working towards a loving world. And your memo of love as the organizing principle of life has personally influenced how I think about work, purpose, and life. And yet my understanding is that love and inner work are interrelated yet distinct concepts. So I wondered if you could expound on the relationship between love and inner work.
Peggy, would you like to start?
All right. So I think fear is the opposite of love. And the issues that we're facing in the world, whether it be climate or refugees, all the things that we think about as problematic, poverty, etc., inspire fear. So, and with good reason. I mean, it's understandable, when we think about the climate being unsustainable for human and other life if we don't really do something quickly, if we don't address issues of poverty and the other things. So how to overcome fear, to me, is the biggest antecedent to getting to love. I mean, obviously there's intimate love, which sometimes can happen even in the midst of fear about other things. But it's a question of how we create the safe containers in our communities, in our organizations, in our families, so that at least in that safe container, people can build a sense of trust and a sense of safety, which then allows them to open up to what is possible, to the beauty and awe of nature, for example, to art, to human relationships, to relationships with nature and other than human beings on the planet. So when we get there, we build a sense of belonging initially to whatever that safe container or community is. And then we can become curious rather than judgmental, because judgmental is a precursor to conflict, and nobody likes to be judged. And we don't really like to judge either, although sometimes that's a factor that makes us feel safe. I'm safe here, but I judge you out there because you're not like me. So getting beyond that leads to further creativity, further openness, and ultimately to the kind of gratitude, and I would say humility is a really important piece of this, and compassion for others different from ourselves, that then leads to the possibility for a broader kind of love, which is really going to be essential for healing the wounds that we're all dealing with.
That's just beautiful. And I'd love to just take a moment and just absorb that. For me, inner work is where I find the strength and will and energy to love. And also where and I've already mentioned this, encounter the deep love that holds me. And I think both are just crucial to our ability to be part of the solution in the world. Maybe we should start talk a little bit about what we mean by love. Because we live in cultures, certainly our culture, I think, has seriously debased the concept of love. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about fierce compassion. I try to think about fierce love in terms of, first off, starting with this just fundamental commitment to the sacred dignity of everybody and everything. We talk at Fetzer about living in sacred relationship with self, other, and the natural world. And it's through inner work that I go back and reconnect with that sacredness of reality, and having reminded myself of the sacredness of everybody and everything. The challenge then becomes, it's, for me, the moral imperative that follows is, if everything's sacred, everybody's sacred, then I have an overriding responsibility to do everything I can to promote their flourishing, the flourishing of everybody, the flourishing of the natural world. And it's through inner work that I strengthen that muscle, really, to try to live in sacred relationship I'm my own spiritual journey has been within the Christian tradition, but at Fetzer we spend a lot of time sharing practices across traditions, and I've got to say, Buddhist loving kindness practice has been powerful for me because I just love it that it starts with holding ourselves in love, and then it helps us recommit to loving the people closest to us who are easiest to love. But it ends up, inviting us to just open our hearts profoundly to the people that are hardest to love. And that inner work, I just, again, my lived experience is if I let that slide and let it slip out of my life, the way I hold people changes, maybe subtly but profoundly. It's much more separation, fear, fixing them, feeling like I have the answers. So I'll stop there.
No, that's beautiful as well. Thank you both for sharing. Peggy, would you like to add anything to an opine on what is love? You mentioned that love is opposite of fear. Tell us a bit more.
Well, I think of it first as a feeling in my chest where my heart resides. So, and I'm feeling this right now, having this conversation and scrolling through the names of the people, many of whom I know and some of whom I don't know, that I'm so grateful to be here and in this conversation with. And speaking of grateful, I think there's probably nothing bigger than gratitude to lead to love. I had an uncle who died at the age of 93, and he said that he woke up every day and his first thought was 3 things that he felt grateful for. And that started his day. It was just a beautiful reminder to me how we can be so full of worries and preoccupations and all our drivenness about what we've got to do today, that it becomes very difficult to open ourselves in the way that we've been talking about more broadly, and in the loving kindness meditation, beyond those who we automatically love, to those who we hardly know, and ultimately to those with whom we have a great deal of difficulty.
Yeah, and Peggy, I would love to continue this thread of thought a little bit. That sometimes we get so caught up in the worries of every day. And Bob, you also mentioned that you are quite heady. You come from a place where you immerse yourself and you think you can fix problems. And personally, I come from that place as well in professional life. And, you know, in 2020, we've all been challenged by this mentality. You've both discussed the role of inner work in tackling burnout. And burnout is real in our workforce, especially among social impact colleagues, and especially confronted in a year like 2020. So, Peggy, can I come to you for this first? As the founder of a global organization, you've had firsthand experience of, you know, the sweat, blood, and tears that go into the taxing work of social change and of entrepreneurship. So will you tell us, Peggy, from your perspective, what role can inner work play in tackling burnout?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can speak from my own experience, but I see that Krista Tippett just joined us, and being one of my great heroes who I listen to every week and derive inspiration from, I just wanted to welcome you to this conversation, and I know Swati will find a time to bring you into it. After 13 years of trying to start Synergos with what was then a kind of weird idea that we have to operate in partnership, but not just partnership among elites, but inclusive partnership in order to solve some of the pressing problems that we face, I was really burned out. And I took what I thought was going to be a 3-month sabbatical, and I moved to Montana, sometimes I say unbeknownst to me, and lived in a tiny cabin in the midst of the wilderness, and ended up living in Montana for 13 years while not being able to give up Synergos and continuing to move back to New York and around the world. But the first thing I began to feel was the comfort of the earth. I would go out walking or skiing or riding every day when I wasn't writing, which was what I was supposed to be there doing. And without any vocabulary to describe it, I began to feel part of a larger whole than just the human whole that I had been working for and with. And I came to think of that as spiritual connection. It took me a few years, I'm still working on it, to develop the kinds of practices that would allow me to renew and regenerate myself on a daily basis. I mean, for me, being outside in wild nature is a big one, but engaging in yoga, other physical exercise, meditation, and increasingly prayer of a sort that I would characterize almost as praise songs. And sometimes when I'm outside, I actually sing them as praise songs about things that I see that are beautiful, or things that I have hope for, or sometimes even things that I despair about. But it's a way of articulating, sometimes interiorly and sometimes out to the world, of what is happening inside that is getting in the way of my becoming fully present, fully loving, and fully, to the extent that it is, fully effective in the work that I'm doing.
Well, thank you for sharing that personal note. And Bob, how about you?
One of the things Peggy and I share is our own intense personal experiences of burnout. I think both of us have found our way through that dark experience by going deeper inside, by stepping back and giving ourselves the inner space. The way I describe how I ended up there is use the phrase that Parker Palmer uses about living a divided life. I had the blessing of being born into a family and faith community that, got me off on the spiritual track of God is love. We're all children of God. We're here to love. And that landed very deeply. But in parallel, I was also on the professional track. I'm a lawyer by training, and spent all of my pre-Fetzer career in Washington, much of it working from the base of a Washington law firm, even though all my work was with nonprofits. And I was trying to meet the expectations of that world too, and didn't realize the huge inner toll I was paying, or price I was paying for that divided life. So the result was a fairly spectacular burnout at one point. And what I've found is that inner work, well, first off, I just committed to not live that divided life any longer, going deep inside. I realized that it was clear to me which side of that divided life I wanted to embrace and which side I wanted to step back from. And inner work was crucial to getting to that clarity, but also keeping that clarity, because there's so much that continually pulls us back. And I'll just also say another experience that Fetzer and Synergos share, Peggy and I share, is a wonderful project several years ago called the Wellbeing Project that was focused on the challenge of burnout of social entrepreneurs. And so we were working with a number of the global social entrepreneur organizations who had come to realize that they had had a hand in cultivating a culture of the social entrepreneur as superhuman, as the person who could just push that boulder up the hill year after year and was really bulletproof. And they were realizing that that's just not the case. And so this was a project that was focused on trying to give social entrepreneurs permission to lay down that burden and take care of themselves, including their inner selves. And the fruits of that project were really astounding. That I think we got so much affirmation of the renewal that people felt both personally and in their work. So I think it's a powerful tool against burnout.
Yeah, and there have been questions from the audience, and I know just in general, a lot of conversations in the social impact space about people getting burnt out in the social impact space, avoiding it, combating it, and kind of your sense of purpose being exploited to extract labor. And so this really gets at the heart of that conversation. And I would love to come back a little bit later and talk about the type of leadership that inner work can foster and the type of organizational leadership, especially in the social impact space. Peggy, there was a question from the audience about something you mentioned about a safe container. Could you tell us a bit more about what a safe container is, what it does, and how it's helpful?
Well, my understanding of that grew from first participating in many wilderness retreats and then ultimately beginning to guide them. And I would say several things. And this can happen in a work environment, it can happen in a therapy group, it could happen at a community meeting. So it's not restricted to wilderness retreats. That just happens to be the basis for my experience. But beginning with some guidelines of, for example, I'm willing to listen actively to everyone else and I won't interrupt. I'm going to maintain confidentiality in this conversation so that I may talk about my own experience to other people, but not about other people's experience. Those are kind of the safety regulations that it's really important to put into place so that people have a certain sense of confidence that eventually, once they get to know each other, morphs into trust of that particular group that begins to build what I call a container. It's obviously not a physical container, within which people take off their masks and allow themselves to say what is really true to them. And in doing so, what almost inevitably happens is at some point, someone will say something very meaningful to them and perhaps they'll cry. And other people feel it. They begin with that feeling in the chest that I described, whether you call it empathy or compassion or love. And it leads to other people out of the trust and sense of belonging that is growing, being willing to take similar risks. And the more those risks are taken and accepted, and the amazing thing is that when people see other people without their masks on, bare, naked, vulnerable, they tend to open their hearts to them. And then the person who's exposing themselves in a certain way understands that instead of shame or wanting to hide, they actually are gaining the empathy or admiration or love of the rest of the group. So it's a mutually reinforcing cycle that leads to that kind of bondedness, a positive kind of bondedness, that if nurtured, and if there's a way of keeping it going over time, we have WhatsApp groups that go on and on and on from the different retreats that we do. And it's just a way of reconnecting to that sense of safety, that place of trust that you've gained that might be, for some people, the only place of that sort in their lives that then allows them to have the courage to go out there and do what they're doing.
Yeah, you know, this is a very values-based conversation as well, that building trust as a value and psychological safety as a value in an organization. And Bob, tell us a little bit about the values at Fetzer that are interrelated with inner work. Do you have something analogous to a safe container?
Yeah, and I'll talk about two different aspects of that. One, the safe container we try to create within our own community for ourselves. And then the safe container we try to create in the convenings that we have a beautiful retreat center. And so one of the central methodologies we use is inviting groups of people who aren't talking to each other, but should be, I mean, just aren't connected, whether it's around social, emotional, spiritual intelligence or democracy. And let me talk about that. We talk about it in terms of sacred hospitality, but when we do convenings, or when we did convenings, when we could do them face to face, and we'll get back there, we would usually have them for 2.5 days. We'd start with dinner and just around the thought that sharing a meal together is one of the most powerful things we can do to experience each other person to person. But then we would, after dinner, invite everyone just to take a few minutes and share the story that had brought them there. And we found that just beginning to know each other's stories took us to a deeper level. And then each session throughout the conference, we open with some form of practice, spiritual practice, that again invites all of us that are in the meeting convening to try to get to a deeper place. And our experience over and over again is by slowing down, we speed up. That it's amazing how quickly a group that has never been together becomes a community if you encourage that deeper openness. So I think, you know, as we think about our work in the world, how we engage people outside our organizations, I just encourage us to think along those lines. But just share a minute internally. I've been connected to Fetzer since the mid-90s. And one of the things Fetzer always, in the internal conversation, talked about was a culture of politeness. That, you know, because of the values we have, we tend to, you know, just be too nice sometimes. But what we had to face up to, and we did this about 7 years ago, it was really better described as a culture of fear and avoidance. We just didn't have the trust among ourselves to be willing to be vulnerable. So what we've done for the last 7 years is take 3 hours a week. We do it now every Tuesday morning, and bring our whole staff community of 60 together to just work on going deeper together, to find our spiritual common ground, to celebrate that we get to the ground on very different paths, but mostly just to learn each other's stories. And that's been absolutely transformative. You know, I walk down the hall now, and instead of seeing somebody and thinking of their position, I think of their story because I know it now. And it's just been week by week over the years developing a greater sense of love, trust, and safety. So I think that creating that safe space, and ultimately that safe and brave space, is just absolutely foundational to everything we do.
That resonates so much with me as somebody who works in the social impact space. You know, a few weeks ago, Synergos hosted a 3-series part conversation on dismantling systemic racism, which of course is larger than any 3-part series. But we had invited Dr. Gail Christopher, who talked about one of the tenets of this racial hierarchy that we live in is separation. And to break that down, listening to each other's stories and seeing ourselves in those stories is so incredibly important. And to understand that that sense of empathy and listening comes from having done inner work or going through it in the moment, is that connection is really becoming visible to me as both of you are sharing your sentiments. So thank you so much for sharing. And I would actually love to also invite Krista into this conversation. I think this is poised, Krista, to grace us with your perspective as well. And if you allow me a minute to just introduce you to our audience, folks, Krista Tippett is a renowned host of the National Public Radio and podcast On Being. She's a Peabody Award-winning broadcaster, New York Times bestselling author, and a National Humanities Medalist. A quote that my colleague shared with me that sums up Krista's brilliance is from President Obama in 2014, after she was awarded the National Humanities Medal at the White House in the US. He says, "On the air and in print, Ms. Tippett avoids easy answers, embracing complexity and inviting people of every background to join her conversation about faith, ethics, and moral wisdom." And we're lucky to have you today with us, Krista. So will you tell us a little bit about your perspective on inner work, how you define it, and join in the conversation with us?
Yes. First of all, I want to apologize. I was supposed to be here at the beginning. Peggy, I did my version of going away, not to Montana, but I was offline, and I guess I forgot how to do Zoom when I was gone. I literally 15 trying to get on. But actually, it's been so wonderful to listen to this much of the conversation. Bob is such a long time, Bob and Fetzer are such longtime friends and partners to my work and to me personally. And Peggy, we were supposed to have met in that world that is now vanished. Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't think there's any more important topic than this topic that you've taken up today. One of the ways to think about what happened to us collectively this year in the first of our ruptures is that we collectively, each and every one of us at the same time and in ourselves, were kind of set down on the, felt for the ground beneath our feet. We came back into contact with the most fundamental reality that all our spiritual traditions teach us to live with and befriend and embrace, which is that nothing is as solid as we ever believe it to be. And how do you befriend that reality? And I think the questions that started to rise in our midst, which were social questions, but were also questions of inner life, of what is essential and what is non-essential. It's another, I think Bob saying what is sacred is, I think, a synonym for that question that this gathering would embrace. And if that's the question we're asking, how do we then orient and reshape ourselves and our society around what is essential, what is sacred? So I guess, I'm fascinated that burnout came up. I guess another, what I'd offer to that discussion, and I'm certainly in the club. I'm really an expert at burnout. Another extraordinary way to talk about this moment we inhabit is that the work of the rest of our lifetimes has been laid out before us. And it is work that is going to unfold in generational time, not by next year, not in 5-year plans. I think the history of social movements and of true social change is also littered with the story of idealism that became cynicism because of total depletion. And as somebody who was born in 1960, I'm really aware, I see there's so many echoes of, the great, all kinds of great change that was set in motion in the 1960s, but that was not pulled all the way through. And even within, the civil rights movement and so many of the movements of that time, it was a story of great idealism and great accomplishment and then depletion. And if so I think we're so aware that we have certainly on the racial sphere, but also in just redefining what politics and economies are for, which are questions of what matters, not merely political or economic questions. We have to be grounded in what will keep us alive and resilient. We have to know how to accompany each other. Those of us who've lived for a while and know in our bodies. And Peggy, I love how you keep talking about how all of this, I think so much, I think the promise of our time, we have a promise to really understand human wholeness and live into that and reconnect ourselves in a way that modernity disconnected us. But so much of that challenge of living into the full promise and potential to become whole and to create whole human beings and whole institutions and whole neighborhoods and whole societies is that we have to be whole. And this will be the ground on which we can do the work and accompany each other across generations, across disciplines, that is for the rest of our lifetimes. We need all of our energy, all of our capacities, and all of our gifts.
You know, Krista, one thing that I'm resonating with when you talk about the human wholeness is how exponentially more difficult that is for people, for example, living in refugee camps or people living in conflict. And that raises the question for me, how can, in the work that we all do in the world, how can we create that sense of, even in a small part, and I'm thinking of Ezra Osuer from Turkey, who's on this call, who works with women and children with psychosocial support in the border, in Turkey, on the border of Syria, where there have been, I think, something like 2.5 million Syrians who've migrated into Turkey, who does this in small groups at a time.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are ways, but it's going to take so many of us. And also some groups like the Garrison Institute help support the frontline workers, the humanitarian workers, to regenerate their sense of wholeness and help them get through their sense of burnout so that they can go out there in their full selves and hold that self in the midst of so much misery and complexity, so that they can create those small safe spaces whereby people can actually flourish even in difficult physical circumstances.
Yes, I was in South Africa last year and was with some incredible people who are working with young leaders, young social activists, and really at this level of accompanying them as human beings, so that they can stay vital and whole themselves for this long work of transformation ahead, which is different from just work of change. Those places you know, to think of what I'm describing, to think of this challenge of being whole while living in a refugee camp. I mean, there's so many situations of incredible despair in our world. And yet I think a very humble beginning is not to reduce anyone to their political or economic circumstance, but to take seriously that inner life is actually not, and in fact, the experiences of joy and the capacity to love, these are actually human birthrights. They're not privileges, they are available to people. And to take those seriously as what needs to be nurtured in addition to the circumstances of lives that I think we're better equipped to try to take on.
And I just add to that, I think one of the things I've experienced is that inner wholeness, inner depth often comes to people who have suffered the most. And I just think about the history of the African American experience in the United States, the spiritual depth which really drove the civil rights movement in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and this vision of the beloved community that is so powerful, all emerged from the spiritual depth of that community, precisely because of its suffering. And so Where I go with that is this huge humility. As I learned the stories of people who have suffered far more than I have in life, and see the spiritual depth and strength, it really is a very humbling experience. Not to say that that there's not also a huge toll, human toll from that suffering. But in so much of this, I just think it's important to come back to counter the sense that so many of us who have had privileged existences have of somehow knowing something that other people don't know, or needing to support them because we see more deeply than they do. It's just not been my experience.
No, thank you for sharing that. And that resonates with the project as well, where we talk about many of the practicalities of inner work, how to practice it. And many of the practices and rituals, especially in America, come from ethnic minority cultures and traditions that are much older than the new world that we're living in today. So I think that is a connection we should always be making. When we talk about inner work and when we think about vulnerability, not just personally, but of our groups and our society. And I think people in the audience are appreciating that we're expanding the conversation to include that element in this. Peggy, Bob, and Krista, I would love to come back a little bit to something that you had mentioned previously in our conversation that is so important to this dialogue, which is the connection between inner work and personal transformation. And then, Krista, I'm moving away from change to transformation now. Personal transformation and organizational leadership. You are all leaders at your organizations and in this space. How has inner work helped shape some of your most important leadership qualities? Or maybe I can put it in a more neutral way. What type of leadership does inner work foster? And feel free to jump in.
Well, let me give an example outside myself, but from one of the cases that the Fetzer Institute and Synergos have generated. And this is a case in South Africa where two foundations, but led by one. I only mention the second because it's the foundation of the president of South Africa, and he really got what I'm about to say. Tried to work with the public school system in one of the states that had the worst achievement level. And they went in and talked to people in many, many of the schools. And one of the things that came up, and the Minister of Education for that state saw it clearly, but it was this foundation that actually designed the intervention, was that the teachers had such little appreciation from outside, were given so little reinforcement, and probably were living quite difficult lives themselves. And so they started little retreats for groups of teachers in each of the schools. And it was just, I think it might have only been a day, maybe it was a weekend, but it was an acknowledgement of the importance of the role of the teachers. It enabled them to feel included, even necessary. And somebody on the chat said, what about people who don't want to be vulnerable? You don't start with trying to force people to be vulnerable. You start by creating an agreeable space that they'll be glad to be in. And then as they begin to feel comfortable, the potential for vulnerability arises, but you don't force it. But in this case, that was a major intervention. There were several others, but the school system went from the worst in the country to the best over a period of 2 years in terms of student achievement. Because of that kind of an intervention of recognizing the service that people are giving, encouraging them, making them feel part of a larger whole. So I may have skipped a lot of steps, but to me, that's a very inspirational story of leadership, in this case, initially from the person who led the foundation, but then the leaders of the school system who convened these groups, and the teachers themselves who then performed in a way that allowed the students to really achieve academic excellence.
Mm. And Peggy, would you tell us a little bit about the concept of bridging and inner work? And Bob, I would love to come to you afterwards to see your point of view as well. Peggy, you first.
Yeah, so one of the things we recognized, and Synergos is now 34 years old, so we've had a lot of chance to make mistakes, and we've made a lot of them. But one of the things we began to see years ago when we were supporting the growth of community foundations as types of organizations that could create the social glue, both vertically and across different sectors in society, was that the people who gravitated either toward the board or the leadership of those foundations had certain characteristics that we began to see as enough self-confidence that they could reach out across divides and bring people together, not only the people of their own circle. And we began to look at this, and about 20 years a year ago, started focusing on, okay, so what are the characteristics of a bridging leader? And how could we foster them? And that has become a central tenet of Synergos, because we think we have identified the needed qualities for someone to really become a bridging leader. And you won't be surprised to hear that a lot of it has to do with doing the inner work so that you build the self-confidence and you feel safe enough in yourself so that you can begin to take the risk, because it is a risk when you reach out to someone. You might not even know them, and you probably know that they're different from you, but you reach out, I'll say the words, with an open heart, for an open dialogue that then begins to lead to that trust building that is essential for overcoming whether misunderstandings or conflicts.
I'll just add a couple of things on your last two questions, Swati. First off, connection between inner work and leadership. For me, one of the things I've experienced is that the feeling that if I'm going to be authentic in terms of living the values that are at the center of my own practice, I have to demonstrate my own vulnerability as a leader. And one of the places that's come to a head is I've made some significant missteps and mistakes in trying to lead our community. And I realized that I couldn't just pass over that. I had to acknowledge it and apologize. That was hard to do. And I don't think that without my own, inner practice, I would have really been willing to do it. Now, bridging, and first off, I just want to make a deep bow to Synergos for their commitment to put this concept of bridging leadership at the very heart of the way they work, and to affirm, as Peggy just did, that a key element of that is doing the inner work and bringing that reflective perspective. I guess the growing edge for us right now on bridging, it comes up in the work we're doing around the challenge of renewing American democracy. And we had to begin first by recognizing where we started, which was that our community had always been most comfortable with liberal theological and ideological positions. And so when we looked at our community, most of us really lived in that space. And we realized, we couldn't do the healing work that we feel called to do unless we committed to, broadening our set of relationships, our set of partners, and most of all, our circle of compassion to include folks on the more conservative ends of both of those spectrums. And I don't see how we could do that without the inner work commitment that we have as a community.
Yeah, that's lovely. I love the circle of compassion, Bob. Krista, I have a question for you. And it's possible I jumped the gun and started using the term transformation. You know, in the social impact space, transformation and change are almost alliterations of each other, and we use them interchangeably. And yet you said that we go beyond change to transformation. Tell us a little bit more from both a personal point of view and personal transformation, personal change, and societal transformation, societal change.
What I mean when I'm making that distinction?
Yeah.
You know, somebody who's been a great teacher to me, who I've had a lot to do with at Fetzer, is John Paul Lederach, who's one of the great peace builders in our world. I think John Paul knows more, as much as anybody alive, about what it really takes to truly transform circumstances that felt irredeemable. And, you know, he once said to me, I don't talk about conflict resolution anymore. That's not a goal of mine, because he said, we have tools to resolve almost any conflict, but if you don't transform the underlying ingredients that led to that, it will recreate itself. And you know, I think our racial present is an example of that. I think we changed laws and we didn't fundamentally change ourselves. And I say that as a white person, obviously. And I also think we have tools, have understanding about ourselves that people didn't have 60, 70 years ago. And now we are called to do that work. But again, you know, that is so, and to me, change and innovation are also words like that. You know, the word innovation gets thrown around a lot as though it's a value in and of itself. And you know, honestly, we live in a time of a lot of change that's not good that is not generative, right? Change can be good, bad, indifferent. And innovation is the same thing. It's not necessarily good for us. So I think, you know, I want to ask questions of, you know, I think our culture is very much focused on questions of what and when, and not on why and to what human effect. And to me, that the transformation, the difference between just making a change and the transformation we're seeking is to what human effect. And I think here again, this matter of interior work, of reflection, of discernment, of distinguishing between what is important and what is actually urgent, you know, of taking the time it takes and looking at all the ingredients necessary to make change towards the best of our humanity, the best of our capacities, is the work we're called to now. And those are some of the ways I talk about that distinction for me in using that language.
That's really helpful, Krista, and you know, so critical for the moment that we're in. And I'd love to invite the three of you, perhaps in a conversation amongst you, about the role of reflection. It seems to really be at the heart of inner work. And especially as we go into the third trimester of this year, we're still in a pandemic. We are still in a world co-opted by racial hierarchy. And so many are hurting in this dual pandemic. What is the value of inner work and self-reflection? What is the role in tackling some of these issues?
Can I just say, I love that you called it the third trimester, because something is being born, right? A lot is dying and a lot is failing and a lot is being born. And that's what we're trying to hold here in this conversation.
But it's very scary.
Yes.
And again, you know, when I feel that kind of fear of the uncertainty or of the negative aspects of what's happening
Yeah.
flaring up, it takes an act of conscious will to force myself to sit still, or maybe walk, but to still my mind, because there's so many kinds of emotions that can come up during times like this. We've talked about fear, you know, we've talked about anger, and but those are powerful feelings that I would say sometimes are justifiable and sometimes are needed, but that deflect from the kind of groundedness and centeredness that we need to achieve to be coming from our head, heart, and spirit together.
Mhm.
So coming back, whether it's through meditation or a physical practice or prayer, coming back to a place where we can still the exaggerated intensity of those emotions is a way for me, and I've seen it in others who are much better practitioners than I, to revert to a place from which we can act with purpose and with intention and with compassion. Bob, I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Well, completely agree. And we've talked before about just the critical role of stepping back, of being quiet, of being reflective, being non-goal directed. Many of us who are in this social change field just have lists that are way longer than the amount of hours in the day. And we can fall into a drivenness that squeezes out the space for that. And Swati, I'd like to go back to transformation and just put in a strong vote for talking about and thinking about transformation. We have a long-term goal statement at Fetzer that starts off, our goal is to inspire and support broad-scale, spiritually grounded transformation from an ego-centered way of being grounded in separation and fear to an all-centered way of being grounded in wholeness and love. I sometimes make the case that I think that is the most hard-headed goal statement of any organization I've ever been associated with, because our assessment of the challenge we face is that humanity over the last several centuries has become vastly more powerful thanks to our science and technology without becoming correspondingly wiser, more loving, more compassionate. And that just is headed for disaster, because it makes it so likely that we use that ever greater power destructively. And I don't think we solve that problem in our head. I think the only thing that gives us the wisdom and solidarity to use that ever greater power in a life-affirming way is deep inner transformation from fear and separation to wholeness and love. So it's a high bar, but I don't see any other course that is sufficient.
Krista, I draw a lot of inspiration every week from your interviews with people, and I love the fact that you draw people from so many different backgrounds and different belief systems, and actually you get them to feel safe and vulnerable, and so often they're quite revealing in very touching ways. But the practices that they talk about are really nurturing to me and have been profoundly educational in my own search for what is gonna help me achieve more of a place of centeredness. So I really want to thank you for that and encourage others to listen to On Being at National Public Radio.
Thank you, Peggy. That means a lot to me. It's wonderful to hear you say that. I think, I think that does my kind of sense of mission in starting the show is connected to the question that Swati asked about reflection. There's this whole part of ourselves that tends to get discussed in media as religion or spirituality, but it's a part of ourselves. It's a part of the human enterprise. And it's so neglected in our public life, in our public vocabulary. And Peggy, you're making the connection between reflection and practice, right? To me, it is interior, but it's not merely interior. It's work we do on behalf of our presence in the world. And, you know, I was actually, just because I was supposed to present the introduction to today, if I hadn't had my technical difficulty, but I made this long list of words and practices and qualities that feel more relevant to me and actually more hard. You know, we've tended to talk about this part of life as soft. This would have been a soft conversation 6 months ago. And I think everybody understands it's not anymore. But things like, you know, nurture and cultivation and contemplation, some of these, humility, compassion, loving kindness, even very theological language and concepts just feel so relevant to me now, to our public life, as an offering from our traditions to the work we have to do together. Confession, mercy, lamentations, repair, repentance. Repentance is such an interesting word in both the Hebrew and the Greek. The word itself is kinetic. The word itself is about stopping in your tracks and walking in another direction. So, and I think when we think about something like repentance being a spiritual quality, it is, but it's a spiritual quality that compels you to live differently. And also that I think, as we've been discussing, it gives you the energy and the resources to keep walking. As life and the world have their terror and their hardness, as they do. And also I think accompaniment is another one, because none of us, and certainly there are so many people living in situations where what we're talking about today feels like an abstraction, right? And so none of us can carry these qualities on any given day, but we are called to be present to each other, to walk alongside, to carry these qualities on the days when others can't.
Krista, I'm trying to feverishly write down all the terms that you mentioned, and it really strikes me that you say that this feels like we're living in abstraction, and it does. It's feel a little bit disconnected, yet there is a sense of the collective. There is a sense of the great pause, and people are experiencing very different realities as a result of this, but there is a sense of this global experience. And we have actually, in relation to what you're saying, we have a question from the audience where I'd love your perspective, Krista. If you have recommendations for tools for inner work, whether facing this kind of a trying time or just in general, or facing burnout, what kind of tools would you recommend?
Oh, you know, it's such a big question. I mean, I kind of work that through one conversation at a time, and I look for the people who I think are articulating those or offering those. So, I mean, I think my answer would be in the body of On Being's work. We did a show right during the pandemic about Pema Chodron's book, When Things Fall Apart. That is certainly a relevant book for any time, but for our time. Oh, but there's so much. James Baldwin, I think, for me, is contemplative reading right now. I think maybe rather than answer that question quickly, I could perhaps write something up. We did some care packages at On Being with kind of zeroing in on some resources that are especially nurturing. So maybe I could share that link as well.
That would be wonderful. And I love the idea of sending care packages to our audience members.
Contact care packages, yeah.
Contactless. And Peggy and Bob, how about you? Do share with us some of the practices that you employ for inner work.
Want to go, Bob?
Why don't you, Peggy?
I'm distracted by a comment that our friend from the Philippines, and I have to say we have people calling in from Singapore and China and the Philippines and Hong Kong, and it's very late at night, and I appreciate your being there. But Dinky Suleiman from the Philippines writes that, you know, how can we share all of this with people who are so busy trying to survive that they have to keep moving?
Mhm.
So how can they come into stillness? And I would say one answer to that I know is true in the Philippines. It's a very religious society and mostly Catholic. But I know so many people who simply pray a lot.
Mhm.
And whether they're praying for help or survival, or whether they're giving thanks to God. In the most desperate situations, I was listening to National Public Radio this morning to a Syrian refugee whose but he was in Jordan, whose 2 children were killed in a tent fire in a refugee camp. And, you know, how do you go forward with that? And his answer was, it's in the hands of God. So I'm not saying that that's either true or the best way to approach things, but sometimes when we get to that level of desperation or grief or rage, there needs to be some kind of an outlet that takes us beyond ourselves. So whether it is prayer or whether it's devotion to our planet, devotion to the beings on the planet, or meditation. And I'm having a back and forth with Bob about whether we could do a loving kindness meditation to close this. And Bob is saying he's not sure he should do it. Could I do it? And I'm not sure I could do it. But I do feel that that kind of a meditation that starts with compassion for ourselves and then goes the easy route of to those that we already love, and as Bob described, goes out into the world, is one of the ways that I find most amazing. And actually, JT, I see you're on the line and you might be the only person technologically competent to do this. There's a song by Jennifer Barazan called In These Arms, which is a song, but it also goes into a repeated meditation of the loving kindness prayer and has different artists performing it. If we can't actually play it, which would just the second cut on it would be, it's about 2 or 3 minutes, would be amazing. But maybe we could post the In These Arms album, because it's truly beautiful. And there's words that I'm not going to be able to recover exactly accurately, but it starts with, and when I've done my part and I do all that I can, it starts with, you know, the fear and rage and war that bring me to despair, but I try to do my part. And when I've done all I can, I know that, and here's where I'm not going to get the right words, but the wind in the trees, it comes to save me. The light on the meadows will not desert me. And there's a third thing, and they're just such simple, beautiful. Oh, here it is. Oh my goodness. The light on the hills is full of mercy. The wind in the trees, it comes to save me. The silence, it will never desert me. I long. Oh. You can see it. I long to hold the whole world in my hands, in these arms. And then it goes on with the song. It's just, it brings me back to what's important.
I feel like you've just shared the fruit of your own years of practice, because what just welled up in your heart is just beautiful. And I think that maybe more than anything we've said, that speaks to me. Well, just in terms of my own practice, I don't, I feel like I'm just a beginner even after all these years. I don't have an advanced practice of any sort. Prayer, long walks out in nature, trying to build into my day just quiet intervals, are, just all things that work for me. And then I often joke that my most challenging spiritual practice is my marriage, because it's in that most intimate relationship that I find myself falling down most often and having to get back up. And so I think just trying to make my day just a meditation on how I can bring as much love into every interaction becomes a spiritual practice, has become for me a spiritual practice. I think we all figure it out.
Bob, I'm trying to take a page from your book as well, ever since I read the Love as the Organizing Principle of Your Life. I had my husband read it, and thinking about my marriage as my spiritual practice has really shifted the way that I think about purpose and life and what's important, especially in this challenging time when you start to think about what you spend time on versus what's actually important. Mm-hmm. And thank you, Peggy, so much for sharing your heart with us. And thank you, Krista, for joining us. Mm. It's been my privilege to host the three of you. We've talked about so much and gone so deep. We've talked about inner work and social change, social transformation and change. We've talked about love, burnout, vulnerability on a personal level, acknowledging those who are more vulnerable than us. And we've also talked about some of the tools. Thank you so much. I also love the idea of care package. And audience, thank you so much for your questions, your reflections, your heartfelt connections with each other. This has been a truly kind of a touching moment for me. Not every webinar, not every digital connection has the ability to touch you in this way. And we hope that you will join us again. And we hope that you have something that you took away from this interaction as well. That concludes the fireside portion of our program today. You will receive a follow-up email, a care package, so to say. So please look out for it. In the meantime, if you have questions, thoughts, comments, please don't hesitate to contact us. We're here. We are part of your world. We are part of your network. We're at synergos.org. Find us on social media. Feel free to reach out directly. Thank you once again to our guests, Peggy and Bob and Krista, and for the privilege of spending this time with you all. Catherine, allow me to hand this back to you.
Thanks so much, Swati. And with that, I'm honored to wrap up the first session of our 4-part learning series. Thank you again to our fantastic speakers, Krista, Bob, and Peggy, as well as our phenomenal facilitator, Swati. I hope this has been an enriching conversation for you all. I personally have taken a lot away from it and have thought about the mutually reinforcing relationship between inner work and meaningful social transformation. Lastly, allow me to share my gratitude to everyone who participated in our discussion today. We appreciated your thoughtful questions, your reflections, and heartfelt connections to one another. We hope that you'll bring the same energy to our next session, which will take place on September 16th at 9 Eastern, where we'll dive into the lessons from these case studies and explore the question, what does it actually look like to practice inner work? Thank you so much, and be well, everyone.